Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. This is the third and final webinar in the My Life, My Choice Spring Prevention Webinar Series. So we're very happy to have you all with us today. We will be talking today about the ways in which men enable the insidious crime of commercial sexual exploitation and the steps they need to take in order to be part of the solution. I'm Kyle Mushkin. I'm the Director of Prevention at My Life, My Choice, and we have three really incredible panelists here today. We're very excited they could join us. So our first panelist is Audrey Morrissey. She is the Associate Director and National Survivor Leadership Director at My Life, My Choice. Audrey has served as a primary consultant to the Massachusetts Administrative Office of the Trial Court's Redesigning the Court's Response to Prostitution project, and she's a nationally recognized advocate for the equality model of regulating the sex trade. And our next panelist is Peter Qualiatine. Peter is the coordinator of Modeling Equality. He has been working to promote men's accountability and end commercial sexual exploitation and other forms of gender-based violence for over 30 years. In the early 1990s, he co-founded the Sexual Exploitation Education Project in Portland, Oregon, where he created one of the first sex buyers intervention programs in the country. During that time, he also worked with the Portland Women's Crisis Line to integrate the issue of commercial sexual exploitation into a comprehensive middle and high school program to prevent gender-based violence. And presently, Peter lives in Western Massachusetts and he coordinates Modeling Equality, a project funded by the Novo Foundation to catalyze the creation and implementation of policies and practices across multiple sectors that address commercial sexual exploitation through an equality model framework. And our third panelist is Luke Goldworm. Luke is currently an assistant district attorney and the chief of the Crime Strategies Bureau at the Suffolk County DA's office in Boston. Luke is an assistant, as assistant district attorney, Luke has worked in the Child Protection Unit, overseeing the district attorney's child sexual exploitation and trafficking cases as part of the Internet Crimes Against Children's Task Force. Prior to serving as ADA, Luke was a criminal investigator working cases at both the federal and state levels in the areas of crimes against children, human trafficking, cybercrime, terrorism, and white-collar crime. So welcome to all three of our panelists. We're very excited to hear your thoughts. So as our panelists are speaking, we have a number of questions for them. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will take time for as many of those as possible during our Q&A at the end. If you'd like to direct your question to any particular panelist, please indicate that as well, and we'll make sure the correct person is answering the questions that you have. So let's get started. Our first question is for Audrey. So Audrey, when we see the news, the high-profile stories related to commercial sexual exploitation relate to arresting the pimp, the exploiter. And this is what makes news, and it is important. But from your experience and your expertise in the field, why should more attention be on the buyers?
Hi, everybody. Great question, Kyle. Well, for me, I mean, I could really answer that really simply. If people didn't buy people, people wouldn't be able to sell people, right? And so we wouldn't have an issue with exploitation if people didn't buy people. And, you know, when I think of how little things have changed in that area, right? I know there's been lots of conversation, but even if I take a step back to when I was in the life, and it's still kind of traumatic to think about how, you know, there were times where I might have been caught with a buyer, right? And let me just say this and be real clear about this. An upper middle class white buyer, right? And, you know, the police would say things like, "What are you doing hanging out with people like that?" I've also had experiences of being caught with a buyer and I was the one that was arrested and the buyer was let go, which is like such, you know, as far as I'm concerned, you know, and I know people are working on it, some states better than others, but when I really look at the big picture and my experience, that to me still hasn't changed much. Meaning the privilege of being a white male still stands and it stands tall in the movement. One of the things that I want to say about that, and this is not beating down law enforcement, but one of the things that I came to realize, and in doing this work, my own experience, and in doing this work, when a sting takes place, right, and we're talking, if we take children out of it, because of My Life, My Choice, right, we focus on children. But let's just say, it's a situation, it's, you do a sting, there are two adults, the upper middle class white man, right, buyer that's in the sting. What I really came to realize when it came to law enforcement, a lot of them are upper middle class white men, right? And so it doesn't come from a place of I'm a bad cop, but it almost comes from a place of that's my peer, right? What are you doing here? Get out of here. Go home to your wife and kids. It's almost the thing. We have families. Don't embarrass us. Get out, shoo. And when the real problem, absolutely, the real problem is the person who continues to buy. And what we know for sure, let me be real clear, all men don't buy sex, but we know that what fuels the commercial sex industry is the repeat buyer, right? So the repeat buyer drives up the market by probably 75%. Then we ask, well, why are you a repeat buyer and why do you drive the market up? Because in most cases, they know that they're not going to be held accountable, even in their mind, because even when you buy someone, let's keep it 100. When you buy someone, you have to believe that they're lesser than someone else, right? So the buyer that goes in to purchase someone already has a mindset, hey, if we get caught, this lower person, they're going to take, not, they know they might be embarrassed. They're not looking to get caught, but society has dehumanized girls and women in the life, right? So they're seen, right? Even get prostitutes, we're not seen as people. And so, if I think I can get away with some stuff, like if I can pass bad checks, and I might be like, shoot, I might be able to pass about 100 of these before I'm even get a slap on the hand. I'm gonna keep passing bad. I'm gonna take my risk and pass the bad checks. You know what I'm saying? And so privilege, the bottom line, privilege plays out in here when it comes to the focus not being on the buyers. Don't focus on the good guy. He's a lawyer. He's a doctor. You know what I'm saying? My mother's pastor was in a sting, right? These are upstanding. And of course, let me just say this too. My mother's pastor was in a sting. They did a sting. He was a pastor, but he was a Black pastor. So that was all over the media. Do you understand what I'm saying? So he was a buyer. He was absolutely out of order. But do you think the focus would be on a white priest that was in a sting? Right? Nope, shoot, get out of here. People know, and so we have to focus on the problem. The focus, it's like anything else. There are businesses that go out of business all the time because of lack of sales, right? Plenty of things have gone out of business because of lack of sales. We have to focus on the buyers, and we have to address privilege in all areas, just in the world that we're in today, right? And so we really have to pay attention to that and hold the privilege accountable, and we have to focus on that.
Thank you, Audrey. Our next question is for Peter. Peter, from your years of experience working with buyers, who are they? Audrey just gave us a preview of that. And also, why do men buy sex? You're muted, Peter.
Of course I am. It wouldn't be a webinar unless I muted myself at some point. So thanks for having me, first of all. It's always a pleasure to be on panels with Audrey, and My Life, My Choice is one of my favorite organizations. So I'm just really thrilled to be here. Audrey said it best. It's fundamentally about privilege, right? That people who buy sex are not a homogeneous group, but they are, in that they're almost exclusively men, and they feel entitled to pay for sexual access to the bodies of other people. Even more so, like if we're looking at other forms of gender-based violence, yes, sometimes men are the victims, sometimes women are the perpetrators. It's predominantly men's violence, right? But when we look at the area of sex buyers, it's off the charts, even when it's a trans person or a boy or a man that's being bought. The person who feels entitled to commodify the body of the other is a man. And so that, I think, is that's the link. And why? I think it's largely about entitlement. It's really about because they can, and because they feel like, well, I'll give you two quotes from sex buyers that I worked with that I think really speak to why men buy sex. I used to interview all the men that came through the sex buyers class that I taught in Seattle before they came through the class. And I would ask them if they had any insight into their sex buying. And there's two quotes that really always stick out to me. The first is this guy who said, "I buy sex because the only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection," right? The only thing I'm more afraid of than intimacy is rejection. So you can see there that it's really fundamentally about power and control and wanting to be the person who can't be rejected, who gets to do what he wants, who has no responsibility to treat the other person like another person, right? Because what? If he treats them like a person, then he could be rejected, or they could break up with him, or they could tell him no. And so he wants to be able to control the situation. The second quote is something really similar. I asked this guy, "Why do you buy sex?" And he said, "Well, I buy sex because I love sex, but I hate women." And that threw me even. I'd heard a lot, but when I heard that flat out like that, I had to ask him, "What do you mean you buy sex because you love sex, but you hate women?" And he said, "Well, I love sex, but I hate women because I was married to one of them for 15 years, and then she left me and took half of everything I had, so I'm never gonna trust one of them again, and I'm just gonna pay for sex." And so my response was like, I had the aha moment. I said, "Oh, you're hurt. You feel betrayed, and you have no clue about how to work through your grief and how to deal with your shit. And rather than deal with your own hard feelings because you find yourself incapable of doing that, you project your own stuff onto not just people in prostitution, but half of humanity, and then target them because of it." And so to me, that really captures kind of what sex buying is all about. Is it's a problem with the hearts of men. At best, sex buying is sexual misconduct, and it exists on a continuum of sexual violence. If we look at the far end of the continuum and things like sexualized murder, do they happen? Yes. Do they happen more to women than to men? Yes. Do they happen more to women in prostitution than other women? Absolutely. People in prostitution are targets all along a continuum of violence. And at the lowest end of the continuum, it's about the objectification and dehumanization of the other. Another quick story that I think captures why men buy sex and what it's all about is back in Seattle, I was having coffee one time with a man who was self-referring to our sex buyers program. So he wasn't caught by the police, but we always kind of had space for folks who wanted to make this change voluntarily. And so I met with him for coffee to just kind of meet him and see what he was about. And the first thing he did when we sat down was looked at me and said, "Peter, I just want to let you know that I'm a good John. I never hurt the girls physically." He went on to say, "I never hurt them emotionally." And then he stopped himself. And he said, "Well, you know what? I'm not sure if I hurt them emotionally or not, because when you look in their eyes, it's like they're not even there. It's like they have a mask on or something." And so my question to him was, like, what part of this other person being dissociative told you that it was a great time to go and have sex with them? If they have to psychically leave their body in order to get through this act, it's obvious that this isn't about consent. It's obvious that this isn't about mutuality, right? Do you behave that way with other people in your life? He went on to say, "No, no, I wouldn't have sex with another woman unless I was paying her." So it was the money for him, right, that bought the consent. It was the money that made this okay. And so I think that fundamentally we need to tackle that issue, that this is sexual misconduct at best, right? And it's about the dehumanization and objectification of the other, and primarily women. And so if we're going to be serious about stopping gender-based violence, I believe we really need to look to the fundamental place that commercial sexual exploitation has, the role that it has in continuing these forms of gender-based violence and exploitation. And it's a great way to kind of unpack other forms of violence too. But I'll save some time for other folks and let you ask your next question, Con.
Thank you, Peter. Very well said. So our next question is for Audrey, and you've already started talking about this, but can you tell us a little bit more about how issues related to racism come into play in the commercial sex industry, and what does that have to do with buyers?
Well, we know for sure, not only racism, classism, sexism, all of that plays out, right, in the commercial sex industry. But when we talk about racism, let me give you, it goes back to law enforcement, right, who can really make a difference, right, when it comes to buyers. I remember a survivor said to me that her and a woman of color were stopped by the police, right? Put them in the back of the car. The police says to her, says to the woman of color, I know why you're out here. But then he said to my white girlfriend, but what are you doing out here? And it was that piece where he he basically let the Black girl go. You know what I'm saying? Like, right? While he took the time to have this conversation, right, with the white survivor. And one of the things that, and I come from Boston. Boston was one of the most racist states in the country, northern states. It really was. It was really, listen, we kind of would talk about it now, like at least in the South, that, people would tell you they didn't like you. You know what I mean? It's just like, but Boston was real bad. When I think of, because I always like to go back to my experience and bring it up to today. I remember, being a light-skinned Black woman, right? I remember like how darker skinned Black women were mistreated. You know what I'm saying? I remember being like in strip clubs and peep shows, and I remember the owner would come in, and if he saw a Black girl on the stage, get her out of here, put a white girl on the stage. So I say that to say that we, girls and women of color, even in the commercial sex industry, were devalued, right? Which basically, when it talks about what does that have to do with buyers, right? It breaks down to, I can pay this girl of color less money, right? And purposely cause her more harm, right? Not that girls who weren't of color, horrible things didn't happen to them, but at the hands of buyers, there was a lot of rapes, beatings, right? Because people of color were seen as less than, and we can offer them less money too, right? And so when I think of buyers, and I think of this movement of pro-sex work, and I haven't seen the white men come forward and say, yes, we do want to buy people, right? I haven't. Where are they? And I mean, for me to truly, right? If you want to change my thinking, they're not coming forward saying, I want to buy people. But when it comes to them buying sex, listen, and for a full decrim, one of the reasons, not that those are not my people, right? Because people in those are my people, right? But the problem here is that as a woman of color, white men have always taken advantage, if we even go back to slavery, right? Having sex with the Black slaves, right? Their privilege has always given them the right to take advantage of people of color. In slavery, you just took the sex, and the life, I'll just give her less money and do more, right? And I'll just cause more harm. Like I'll give her the money and then I'll rape her and take my money back, right? And so we have to really, buyers play a huge role around that whole racism piece and that whole devaluing of girls and women of color. And I'm going to say this because I remember a buyer said to me once, he said, nobody will marry you. And this was a regular buyer. This wasn't some random guy that just picked me up that night. I'm talking, this was a repeat buyer who I had known for some time. But proceeded to, white guy proceeded to tell the girl, no one's going to marry you. Well, he probably really believed that because I'm a girl of color, you're a prostitute. Peter, I always wish that I would run into him so I can say, damn it, I've had 2 husbands and God damn it, I don't want another one. You know what I'm saying? I really, for real. But the racism plays out here in a number of ways. And more importantly, and I'm gonna say this, the last thing, someone had sent me, they did a sting once in Boston. They sent me the article. There were about 8 women of color, right? In the sting, mugshots. Clearly they were all drug addicts, really, really struggling. Well, if you did a sting, where were the white buyers that were buying them? And so we continue to the racism piece, those brown bad people, and we'll excuse in this sting the buyers. So it goes hand in hand.
Thank you, Audrey. Another question for Peter. Is there anything that can be done to address this, or is it simply a boys will be boys issue and men will always buy sex?
No, most men don't buy sex, but most people who buy sex are men. And so we really need to tackle the issue of men's entitlement. That it's not a given. And in fact, what we know is even most men who buy sex say they want to stop. 65% of men who buy sex say they want to stop buying sex. So I think this speaks to kind of culturally and socially what boys and men learn at a pretty young age about sex and about themselves as emotional beings. What we learn as boys is you can meet your relational needs through non-relational sex. But you can never get there from here, right? But that doesn't stop men from trying, right? Right, and like if you get laid, then you'll feel okay, right? And orgasm is an incredible behavioral reward for learning to treat a person as an object, and it's a small step from object to commodity, where you're totally in control of the situation, right? So we learn these behaviors. It's the same thing that's at the root of domestic violence. It's the same thing that's at the root of sexual assault. Or sexual harassment. I mean, what is prostitution if not quid pro quo sexual harassment, right? Like if I've learned anything from the Me Too movement in the past 5 years or so, it's that sexual activity should not be a condition of employment. If sexual activity should not be a condition of employment, then it shouldn't be a condition of employment. And it's simply not okay to say, oh no, not to this white professional woman in the workplace, but that youth of color on the street with no options, yeah, do it to them, right? If quid pro quo sexual harassment creates inequality in the workplace, prostitution creates inequality in the world. And the way that we remedy that is by challenging the entitlement to pay for sex. And I really resonate with something that I always resonate with things Audrey says, but something that she said before that I think was really important is that what happens in discourse around the commercial sex trades is women get pitted against each other. You know, the quote, empowered sex worker over here gets pitted against the survivor who thinks prostitution is inherently harmful. And while that catfight ensues, men just continue to do whatever we want. And so I think that this is a space where we need to pivot and not discuss kind of agency of those that are exploited, you know, because even if you control some of the conditions of your exploitation, it's still exploitation. And we need to pivot and look squarely at the misconduct of the buyer who feels entitled to pay for sex and challenge that fundamentally, right? If Andrew Cuomo has sexual misconduct based on what we've heard about what he's done in his office, then certainly men who buy sex have some accounting to do for their behavior, because it is a form of sexual misconduct. And it's not a given, you know, most men don't do it. But, you know, unfortunately, most men also aren't willing to stand with those who are exploited because we're so terrified of other men's violence, because we know what men can do, right? I think we learn at a pretty young age that if you get put into a class with women or gay men, or you get called queer or get called a pussy, that it's like putting a target on you. And so you have to pretend, you have to develop this persona, this manhood act that's based on the subordination of others. And when the biggest jerk in the room sets the norm by putting down women or by putting down queer folks, right, then men many times are silent. Because what happens when we speak out? What happens when we speak up? What happens when we expose ourselves to the same sort of violence and the same sort of pushback that our sisters and our queer brothers have to live with every day? And so I think that this is really a challenge for men to step up and step into our full humanity and be able to call in other men to account for the violence that happens to others, right? That it's fundamentally about a shift in the way that we conceptualize power in the world. And it's a moving from power over others towards shared power with others, and the power of mutuality, the power of solidarity with those who are the most oppressed. And so this is like a crucial role for men to play. And so it's not, is it inevitable that men buy sex? Of course not. But I hope that it's inevitable that men do something about the harm of commercial sexual exploitation.
Thank you. All right, so Luke, Peter has laid a framework for shifting men's accountability around sex buying. You have been instrumental in creating the Male Allies Initiative at My Life, My Choice. So why did it feel important for you to become involved in this way?
Thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you, everyone, for having me. It's an honor to be on with two people I have some of the most respect for in the world of having worked with Audrey and Peter. And it's a wonderful opportunity with two pioneers. And I think looking at men's accountability and taking a page from Peter's book is about looking introspectively, looking internally, and it starts with I think for me it was a journey, right? It started with I can think of a very specific moment in my life in which I was working a case that involved someone who was essentially a failed drug dealer who said a line which now is unfortunately a lot of us that work in this area hear all the time, and it doesn't get any easier to hear, which is you can sell a drug but once, but you can sell a girl again and again. And the commoditization, the turning a human being into a thing was so soul crushing at the time. And I had seen pretty awful things at that point in my career that it occurred to me that this work, one, needed more men involved to take a perspective, and two, and more directly to the topic today, even when we do, we're looking very specifically at those trafficking and not looking at the other half of the equation, which is the demand structure, which brings you to a point where then you say, okay, if we're looking at both sides and we're being honest with ourselves, then the people that are part of this problem look like me, talk like me, then it's incumbent on us to be part of that solution. And if it's incumbent on us to be part of that solution, what does that mean? And it has to be more than just slogans or putting a sign up on your Facebook, social media. It means putting your money where your mouth is, and that is about allyship. That's about to Peter's point, standing up and stepping in. And it starts with, first having, the emotional courage to embrace your faults, your emotions in general. But it also means confronting the folks in your life who have normalized sexualized behavior, violent behavior, inequality. And it is something that a feeling of information and sort of some basic tenets to move the equation up. And so everyone sort of has alluded to tiers of or categories of men, right? Most men don't buy sex, but there's this large group that are repeat buyers. And then if you want to say there's a group that, on their 18th birthday, their uncle takes them, it's one time in their life, right? And then a group that's never paid for sex, but when their buddies are in the locker room making inappropriate comments, they keep their mouths shut. Or they're on a business trip and there's this boys will be boys attitude, they don't say anything. And then I'd like to think there's the last group, which are allies, people that are out trying to impact that change. And if we can shift that dynamic forward, so to speak, right? And push everyone up in that equation. So those that have not felt empowered to speak or don't feel comfortable speaking, if we can get that group to move into a category where when someone in their personal life or professional life says something, they feel comfortable making the statement and coming from a place of knowledge and call them on it, right? My wife, who's much wiser than I am, uses an expression, call someone in, don't call them out. And I really like that, right? And that's what it is. It's about bring them into the discussion, call them into the discussion. Don't call them necessarily out, but have them part of that equation and bring them into that knowledge place and move everyone up in that. And so to that end, we started a group, and actually, both Audrey and Peter were instrumental in helping us form sort of a core ethos in that group about what it was about, what that could look like. And last year in January, we had a group event where men from throughout the community came together, and we addressed some of these issues. And we had different breakout rooms where we talked through some of the issues around, men confronting toxic masculinity. What are the things that we can do as men to sort of take that and make us take a step forward? And as we got momentum, of course, we became sort of mired in a global pandemic. But the concept of male allies has continued through core group and sort of focusing on the things that we can do and influencing the spheres that we can influence. So starting with, I'll call it 3 areas, right? There's always the resource or financial area where we can back causes like My Life, My Choice, and other areas where we can people in the world doing the hands-on work, but more importantly, do the work ourselves. So in areas where there's political discourse going on, Audrey mentioned decriminalization versus, the Nordic model or a partial decrim position where the dialogue shifts a little bit from really holding those accountable who both on the demand side and on the trafficking side, and decriminalizing survivors in the world, and looking at it from that perspective, so that political side, and then really the groundwork of having of moving forward and changing minds and bringing people into the equation, and that is in terms of providing a change in mindset. And so I think there are a number of groups, and we out there doing various things from trying to turn Johns from doing what they're doing to impacting the work going on in various spheres that touch this. In my own personal area, it's about touching on some of the things that Audrey and Peter talked about, which is, why is it that we will lock up women in those instances and let a white middle-class John go back to the suburbs, right? Why are we doing John sweeps once a year to feel good and check a box? Why aren't we actually targeting the demand and repositioning? fortunate in that my professional life, I can take those directions, right? We can turn those corners and make those changes, but it's about finding that area in your life where you can make that direct impact and change, and having people think through that and putting them in that direction.
Thank you, Luke. So you've talked about a little bit of what the Male Allies Initiative at My Life, My Choice has done thus far. If there's anything more you can talk about that, and then also how can men get involved with it?
Absolutely. So the Male Allies Initiative, we've both done in the 3 areas I kind of touched on previously, both in terms of writing and getting involved with some of the political discourse in terms of the decriminalization conversations, and making sure that the absence of white men having in the conversation, to point back to Audrey's statement, where are the white men making statements about buying sex, that the white men making the statement about buying sex are coming from an informed position, and people like Male Allies are saying, this is wrong, right? We should not be turning people into possessory products, right? There's larger conversations that need to be had. There are experts in this industry that you should be hearing from before making those choices, and that we, from our position, we want to raise our voice. And so there's been efforts both to send letters and speak with members of representation, as I said, fundraising, and then basic sort of groundwork, trying to build consensus, bring groups together to have conversations and begin to provide. Peter was instrumental in helping us provide just sort of some basic conversational touch points that we can have with the people in our world, so that we begin to be able to have those just straightforward conversations again in your personal or professional life, and how you can take some of the things that we're talking about and providing, and then bring it back and increase the group, right? The more allies, so to speak, that spread, the more we hope the idea of people supporting in this area will become. And so that's part of that movement. And again, as we come out, hopefully, I'll knock on wood, of the pandemic, the idea is to have more regular events and more touch points with the community. And so I'd be incredibly welcoming of anyone that wants to join us. We have a Male Allies email that goes to at My Life, My Choice, that for anyone that's interested, and happy to follow up, get you involved, have you be involved in our meetings, and we welcome all ideas and new partners. So that.
Great, thank you. Yeah. We are going to move into audience questions, so we have enough time to answer all of the great questions that have come through so far. And so Kaylin, our administrator today, is going to be sending me those, and we will direct them to the right people. So let's see. The first question we have is, this looks like it's for, let's see, I would say for all the panelists. What is a better model for getting rid of the demand, higher prosecution rates or diversion programs for buyers? This is from somebody who says they've worked in the DV field, the domestic violence field, including with initiatives like Batterers Intervention. And they say that tended to be full of people who were repeat offenders, who were not necessarily engaged in the process they were there for.
So I could speak to that one, I think. The populations of sex buyers are kind of different than the DV arrests that get made, largely because they're arrested through stings, and there's a lot more first-time or low-frequency buyers that get caught up in the stings, and so who are much more likely to have a lot more ambivalence about their behavior anyway, and do make some changes. But that said, we're not going to arrest our way out of this, and looking at criminal legal responses, I think, while it's an important part of the equation, it's not the whole equation. And people often think that's funny coming from me, right? Because I'm the guy who does the sex buyers intervention program. But when I'm talking to communities around the country, and they ask me, what should we do about demand? I always say, that it's important to work along a spectrum of prevention, right? And that the demand, arresting the buyer after the fact, while it's important, shouldn't be the only focus. That we need to do work on social emotional learning with boys in elementary school. We need to do prevention work in middle schools and high schools that's integrated into the existing curricula on gender-based violence, right? While somebody's in there talking about sexual assault and dating violence prevention, it should be a time for a conversation about commercial sexual exploitation and sex buying as well. Since we know that buyers start buying at an average age of around 21, right? That's when we should be able to step in all along kind of the lifespan. There should be multiple complementary interventions and prevention efforts that don't just rely on law enforcement after the fact. Because what we know is that even in Seattle, which has where I came from before I moved here, we put between 100 and 200 men every year through the sex buyers intervention class, the 10-week program that we developed. When we did some research with Arizona State University a few years back, we looked at the volume of sex buyers in King County, where Seattle is, on just one website. And when we extrapolated out from some decoy ads that we placed on there, we realized that there were over 6,000 men in a given 24-hour period looking to buy sex online, just in King County, just in a 24-hour period. So if you think of the idea of like, okay, so how many people are going to get arrested for this? Very few. And so we need to think bigger. We need to think about a spectrum of prevention. And we also need to think about working across multiple levels of social ecology and in a lot of different sectors, right? That this isn't just about a problem with individuals, it's about the transformation of society. It's about culture change. And so what do we do to change the culture? What do we do? We target the institutions that we're a part of, the communities that we're a part of. Certainly law enforcement and the criminal justice system has a role to play, but it's not just their deal. It's gotta happen across sectors and across multiple levels of social ecology. The great thing about the law at its best is that it sets a norm that tells us what's okay and what's not okay and why. So it's really important that those arrests keep happening, but we can't rely on them exclusively for change. And I think that that's something that we learned in DV as well, right? That we learned over the years, that we really needed to look at culture change, not just working with batterers, but really working on kind of healthy modes of masculinity and exploring what they look like and helping to support young men to kind of embody values around equality and respect for others. So it's a heavy lift. It's not like we can arrest our way out of it. It's not like we can legislate our way out of it. We have to kind of like change the culture, fortunately and unfortunately.
Thank you. I'm going to direct this next question to Audrey. Someone would like to know that in order to prevent exploitation, this is a big question, but to start out, what are the warning signs and what are some steps to take?
Oh, My Life, My Choice has prevention. Well, if you're talking from the prevention lens of preventing this from happening to our youth, it starts with, at My Life, My Choice, we have a 10-week prevention curriculum that we go into schools, group homes, locked facilities, really anywhere that or anyone who works with adolescent girls. I will say though that it is gender specific. Trans girls would definitely work for trans girls as well. But unfortunately, you can't adjust it to work for boys. I feel like what we need when we're thinking of who's being bought, My Life, My Choice offers that. And you can go on our website. I would suggest if you haven't had the training of commercial CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation of children, because you have to do that first. And then look at when we offer our curriculum training, and you'll be able to run these groups yourself. Now, when it comes to preventing buyers, I know there was something out, Peter, from Chicago. What was the name of that organization?
CASE.
CASE
Yep.
has a curriculum that goes into the schools. Yes, Chicago Alliance Against, yeah, right. So they have a curriculum out that they go into schools and educate our boys. But the flip side, and that you know, towards the buy-in side, but we do need something around prevention for our boys, right? As well, to prevent them from being exploited, because as Peter said, the buyers are exclusively 99.9% of the time men, and they're buying girls, boys, trans youth. They are predominantly the buyers.
Do you know of any programs like that here in the Detroit, Michigan area?
Like which one? With prevention of girls or?
Well, either. Well, it's probably not a lot for boys, but yeah, for girls at this point.
Yeah, well, our curriculum, our My Life, My Choice curriculum is being used in 33 states across the country. So you don't,
Okay.
yeah, you don't, so go on our website. You do not have to live in Boston to be trained on running our groups. You can run them across the country. And we'd be more than happy. And our goal at My Life, My Choice, we're trying to train folks in all the states across the country. So please go on our website and look up when we're offering our next curriculum training, which would be next week. It would probably be too soon. I think that's full already, but we do
Okay.
that quarterly.
I will.
We
I'll
have
go on the
another
website.
one. The next one after next week will be in June.
Thank you.
The end of June, if people are interested. Okay, so I'm going to give this to everybody, and if all three of you would take a few minutes to answer this would be great. So people are asking, and again, we've already spoken about this a little, but to expand on it, what can what can guests here today at the webinar do to help with prevention? And what is one thing that everyone should take away about male accountability and exploitation?
Well, I'll answer that really quickly, and then I'm gonna turn it over to you, Peter. Again, for yourself, check out our website, My Life, My Choice. We have, our curriculum has been, you know, we've been around for almost 20 years. And so you just have to get trained if you're working with youth on getting trained on how to use our curriculum, and go into your community and educate our youth on the signs. Like the curriculum covers, recruitment tactics, self-esteem, what makes you vulnerable, all those things, the media. And so if you want to do if you work with youth and you want to, that's the strongest suggestion that I can give you around prevention. And when it comes to men, if you know a buyer, you need to have those conversations that women, first of all, I don't think that these men really understand that we do not like having sex with them, right? I don't think that they understand the trauma that someone goes through having to have sex with strangers over and over and over again. And so you have to hold, if you know a buyer or the conversation comes up to prevent buying, when you're with your peers, have those conversations. What do you think about men who buy sex? Start a conversation and really help them understand the harm that it causes the people that they're buying. Like when they go back to their middle-class home, you've caused harm. And then if they're underage, you've harmed a child. Like what proof do you have that person was really an adult? You know what I mean? That this is happening to a lot of children. So you just have to be clear in your conversations and call it what it is. It's not an easy topic, so you don't have to talk about it pretty. It's not pretty, so you talk about it the way it is. And Peter, I'll defer to you.
Don't defer to me. It's an honor to follow you, Audrey. I think that this memory keeps coming back to me again and again and again as I'm listening to everyone talk. And it's a recent memory. It just was a couple weeks ago. I was talking to a group in a Midwestern city. I won't name it, but it was a group of prosecutors and judges. And I was talking to them about the importance of having the long-term sex buyers intervention program. And then I was explaining kind of the nature of sex buying and what it's about. And I said to this group, all these little faces on Zoom, I said, often when I would talk to the men when they first came into the class, I would hear the same thing over and over and over again. And they would say, we all pay somehow. Whether you're buying sex or whether you have to marry somebody or be in a relationship with them or buy them dinner or whatever, that we all pay somehow. But sex essentially for them is transactional. And I looked at these little faces of these folks on Zoom, and I saw one of the men was like thinking about it and considering it and nodding his head up and down, as if to say, yeah, that buyer is right. We all do pay somehow. And so to be able to challenge this kind of transactional notion of what sex and sexuality is about, we don't all pay somehow. Some sex is wonderful and mutual and consensual and great, and that's fantastic. Others is coercive and based on inequality. And that is exploitation. That's not sexual activity. And so I think that when we're doing prevention work, we need to get in there and talk about healthy sex and sexuality. We need to talk about mutuality. We need to talk about consent. And we need to talk to boys, to those who are going to feel entitled to pay for sex or get it some other way transactionally, right? Which we could call coercion or sexual assault. And so making that shift in our prevention work to include components about engaging boys. And I say this because I started doing prevention work back in the 1980s on sexual assault. And we were just then moving away from the prior prevention work in the 70s, which was about bringing rape whistles into school, right? And giving them all to the girls and saying, hey, if you're ever sexually assaulted, blow this whistle. And finally, we discovered, hey, while we're in the room, maybe we should be talking to the boys about healthy relationships, mutuality, and consent. And so being able, I think, to make that step in our work around commercial sexual exploitation and sex trafficking is a really important place to go. And something we can all do, is really take our next step. A favorite author of mine is James Baldwin. And he said, the most radical step you can take is your next one. You know what to do to create the world that we want to share together. And so in a directly kind of democratic process, build that world through your relationships with others and through, dare I say it, love, right? That we need to be able to move from these modalities of viewing others as subordinate and power as power over. And we really need to move into relational modes of being that are based upon regard for the other as a human being with all of the value that each of us has. And so, Cordell West, says, what is social justice? It's love in public. And I think that we got to create social justice. And we all know areas where we can dig in and do that. Maybe it's not specifically working on issues of commercial sexual exploitation. Well, you know what? Working on issues of race and poverty, working on other issues of gender-based violence, doing what you can in your relationships is all really going to help move things along. One of the best quotes I ever got from a man after he finished the sex buyers class we did, when we asked him, what are you going to do differently in your life because of this class? He said, I'm going to raise my son differently because I don't want him to be angry and depressed all the time like I am. And for me, that was like, exactly, that's how we transform culture, person to person to person, and by building these communities of care that are based on, positive regard for everybody.
Luke, any last thoughts?
Yeah, hard to follow those two thoughts. Those are obviously fantastic guidance, and I would say, we didn't get here suddenly, right? And there's not a one size fits all or a quick magic bullet to the solution, but it does start with interpersonal relationships and shaping the world around us. And it starts with those conversations and changing the dialogue and the conversation with the people immediately in front of us. And it is not just about confronting commercial sexual exploitation, but also the way we talk about things. you know, the next time someone says either a sexist or racist or trans or homophobic comment, the idea that you don't just sit on your hands or be quiet about it. And you know, I think the other day one of my daughters said something about throwing like a girl, and I said, since when was that a bad thing, right? We've normalized throwing like a girl is a concept that is bad. And I wanted to make sure immediately that I said that comment, and those are the type of things where we begin to influence the sphere around us. It started with boys and raising better men in that part of the equation, and changing the dialogue with the men in our lives now. And so I think shining a light on something that has been a sort of dark and undiscussed area and not uncomfortable for a lot of people to have those conversations, either because they feel like they're putting themselves at risk or it's not a comfortable table conversation. That's where it starts. It's getting out of your comfort zone and having those conversations and pushing the conversation to pull more people into the right side of this sort of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much to all three of our wonderful panelists for being here today and for answering these at times very difficult questions and important questions. And thank you to all of you in the audience for coming. This is the last of our spring series in prevention, and we will be sending out information about upcoming webinars, and all the information from today will also be emailed to you, information about trainings and contact information. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you.
Kyle.
You were awesome.